Alright, so today we're going to talk about programming conventions. Now what programming conventions are is they're a set of rules that programmers should follow to ensure their code is readable for other programmers. And what you're going to understand, first of all, is that these programming conventions have absolutely no influence on how the program actually functions. This means that if you break every single one of the rules we're going to talk about today, it won't make any difference to the final end user. Your program will run perfectly fine. The difference, though, is that if you try and break all these rules and another programmer comes to look at your code, it's going to make it very difficult for them to understand what your code is doing. It will also make it very difficult for you yourself to understand your code should you have to come back and look at it months or years later. The first convention we're going to talk about is indentation. Essentially what this means is that all lines of code should be indented at the same level. And every time you have a new open squiggly bracket, you should be indenting or tabbing over another tab, with all lines within that section being indented at the same level. So for example, if we take a look at a piece of code written for the grade 12 programming course, you can see every time I have an open squiggly bracket, everything is immediately lined up at the same line. And then I have another open squiggly bracket and we're lined up again, and all code is at the same level. So this is proper indentation. It makes it very easy to see quickly what parts of code fall inside a particular method or inside a particular class. The second convention is with the program header. This is essentially a set of comments that are going to describe the program for other programmers. Your header should always include the name of the program, who created it so they know who to go back and yell at later if it doesn't work, the date it was last created or modified in case you have multiple sets of the same file, you can see which one the most recent one is, and a brief description of the purpose of your program. So again, in that example that I was looking at before, you can see at the top up here we have a proper header naming what the name of the class is, who made it, when it was last modified, as well as what this particular program is supposed to do. The name of your program. All programs should have a name that is descriptive of their purpose. The names themselves must always begin with a capital letter and use the intercap naming convention. So if you have more than one word within the name, instead of having a space between each word, you should start each new word with a single capital letter. It's also very important to notice that all program names must be the same as the name of the .java file that they are stored in. So again, you can see the example here. The name of this particular program is Soccer Player Test, and you can quickly read because each new word starts with a capital letter. And that's also, incidentally, the name of the .java file, Soccer Player Test, that this program is stored in. Comments. Sections of code should have a comment to describe that section's function. Now, it's very important that this means to you that you're not commenting every single line of code. Any good programmer should be able to read one line of code and understand what that line of code does. Okay? If you comment every single line of code, it makes all the comments basically useless because you can no longer try and scan through quickly to find certain sections. The idea of these comments is basically like chapter headings. So you can quickly scan through and find, oh, here's the next chapter, oh, here's the next chapter, and find where your issue is that you're trying to work on. Also, every time you have a closing squiggly bracket, you should put a comment beside it saying what section of code you are closing. So again, here you can see I've got a comment which starts incidentally with the double slash. That's how you start all lines of comment. So the line of comment here says this is my main method. Here's where I'm going to declare my variables. I'll put a couple extra ones in here for proper commenting methods, but we've got move robot, and then at the end, whenever I close a squiggly bracket, I should say this is my main method, and this is the end of my class. Okay. Whitespace. So to make things a little bit easier to read, you don't want to have all your code in one big long thing because it makes it difficult to break up different sections. So every time you have basically a new section or the same idea being in an essay, if you were to start a new paragraph, you'd indent that first line or separate them with a blank line. Same thing here. Every time you have a new section, you want to separate it with a blank line so things are nicely spread out. So again, in this example here, here's where I'm declaring all my variables. Here's where my program is going to start moving the robot. I've separated those two sections with a blank line so it's easy to see the change from one section to the other. Variable names, also like the name of a class, should use the intercap method. The difference is a class name starts with a capital letter and a variable name starts with a lowercase letter. This makes it very simple for programmers to understand whether something you're naming is either a class or it's a variable. Okay? Variable names also should be descriptive of what they're used for, and they should be kept as short as possible while still being descriptive. You don't want them basically to be any more than 15 characters, because every time you have to use that variable, you're going to have to type out its name. And if you make it some ridiculously long name, then you're going to get really bored or irritated trying to type it out every single time, especially if you're prone to making typing mistakes. If you have a variable that's constant, or that its value never changes throughout the entire program, like the value for pi or the value of tax, for example, these should be written in all capital letters to show the programmers that they are constants and they should never change throughout the entire program. Every time you declare a variable, you should also follow it with a description of what that variable is being used for. Yes, I know your variable names should be descriptive in themselves, but just to add a little bit more description and clarity, you want to also have a comment describing their use. Make sure when you're doing this, you're not just sort of saying, oh, this is an integer variable, because we know it's an integer variable because you've declared it as an integer type. It should be more descriptive than that. It's saying what that integer variable is used for. And whenever you declare those variables, they should always be declared together in a group at the beginning of the section of code in which they're used. Again, you can see the example here. Here's where my variable declarations are happening. Okay, I've declared a city and a soccer player object, so two separate objects, and here's a description of what those things are. That's it. Those are all the conventions we're going to talk about at this point. As we learn more concepts, I will be throwing in new conventions that you should be following. But from this point forward, every program that you create should be following those proper programming conventions. This is where your communication mark will come into play. That's it. We'll see you again tomorrow and practice these programming convention skills.